Hello and welcome to my V Premium deck profile for Fenrir. So I went to locals and tried this out. This deck was mainly just designed to mess with Steam Maidens, of course. There's been a bit more Genesis usage lately in general because of the promo that can counter, but also because decks like Valkyrian can also just try and blast them out, hopefully, through a high roll or something. And so I'm going to go through this deck file just to also add as well. I've decided to just change the mat that I'm using. I just picked one random mat from my bag and pulled this out as the raffle. But I just thought that since I've been using the same playmat as the background for my videos, I just thought I'd try and maybe change it up a bit this time because I've not really been paying attention to that lately. So to start with, Scion Vanguard, who cares? Any V series star is fine. 4 copies of Fenrir. So this guy, what he does is he can search your deck for any card with the same grade as a card that you Soul Blast from your Soul. And then what you can also do is that you can Counterblast 1 to revive a card that's been Soul Blasted. But ideally you don't really want to do that with the main phase skill because you can actually use it during the battle phase, which is through his other skill, which is Soul Blast 1 on attack, gain 10k power. So what you could do is you could basically, for example, if you have this card in Soul, you can literally just call him back out as an example, and then get an additional attack and use him twice because Vanguard, which we're playing 4 copies of, what he can do is that he can on play Soul Blast 1 retire a card, and then if you're basically calling it normally, but then you're also then calling it again via Fenrir, you're getting 2 retires for very cheap, which is Soul Blast 1 per time that you call him, or per retire. So that's really good. Obviously, if you ride him, you can literally nuke the entire field because he's got an ability where he can do that from Vanguard. If he's on Vanguard, then he just takes the entire field down with him, basically. And the other thing is as well is that you don't actually have to Superior Call through Fenrir's on attack 10k ability. You can also use Gleipnir, for example, to attack with Gleipnir, gain 10k, and then just combo the Superior Call of Gleipnir. If, for example, you just need to do some situational planning around it for whatever reason, then that's also an option. And another thing as well is that Fenrir's skill of Spirit Calling isn't just during your own turn, it's just in general, so you can do it during your opponent's turn. So there's a card that we play which can Soul Blast during your opponent's turn, which will then help you to trigger Vanguard and retire during your opponent's turn and disrupt their attacks. And another thing as well is that Vanguard's skill, so not only is spamming him really good for the retires, but he's also very good because he stacks your deck. So what you can do is you can attack with him first, and then you basically set up your triggers, and obviously Soul Charge anything that's useful in Soul, and then bot deck something you want to save for later. And then what you do is then you'd have Fenrir Swing, Superior Call, or Gleipnir, I guess. And then when you get Vanguard back out, well, you can basically make use of Fenrir to get the drive checks, and then after you can go into Vanguard for the damage check, so you can set up your damage triggers for the next turn. So you can basically make it so your deck kind of controls an element trigger. You can only really control one trigger. It's not like Oracle Think Tank or like Vanguard from G series where you can actually check multiple cards. This can only stack one card, so you won't be able to control the second trigger. And he also helps you build Soul, so he's going in your Soul. He's a grade 3 himself, so that's good with Yasurasu as counting towards grade 3s. But also he's getting you 2 cards in Soul because he's a Soul Charge, and he's also putting 1 card from top 3 into your Soul. So that can be helpful as well. So that's 4 copies of Vanguard. Next we have 3 copies of Yasurasu, mainly as a finisher ideally. So you ride this like later on in the game, you just keep riding Fenrir, get your markers, and then you get to Yasurasu, and then you just go for the finish play once the game is dragged out. This is a bit of a slow deck. It's not very aggressive. It's more of a defensive control deck. So Yasurasu, thing is by then your opponent might already be chilling with a bit more defense, less damage, which is kind of a downside. It's not like the most aggro deck. So because of that, you have to be a bit smarter with how you try to finish your opponent. But the thing is at least that when Fenrir is attacking, you're not like, unlike using Himiko at times where, you know, you might just be clumping crits or something, and then suddenly if your opponent's surviving all those crit attacks, then what you might be doing is if you're riding Yasurasu of Himiko, then you're basically just working from your opponent, maybe already being on low damage still, so it's a bit weird in Himiko sometimes. But in this case, Fenrir, like there's gonna be a lot of no guards happening, so it's not like, it starts to feel a bit more progressive. Like it feels like it kind of leads in a bit, which isn't as bad. And with those force markers, obviously this deck doesn't turbo markers like Himiko or to some extent Fortuna when it's lucky. Basically what you do is what you can do is basically that you can set up multiple markers. And just like with Fenrir, when you're superior calling over, because you can superior call over a unit with a marker. So ideally, I put Vanguard on a force marker, and then put Vanguard Salt, and then call over the now vacant force marker circle with another card, like usually Vanguard. In this case, it's the same with Yasurasu. She's restanding that unit, so you're using that force marker twice. It's also just like a reminder of why Steam Maidens is so scary. Like any deck with force recycling that uses the force marker multiple times is very strong. So this is only going to do 2 attacks with it, so nothing beyond that. But obviously, in the long game, you build up more markers, and that becomes better. Now, you might be decking out by this point because you might have already been burning with Apple Witch Cider, for example. So if that happens, what you could do is you could just go for the not the draw 2 part and just only Soul Blast some of grade 7. So you just have the restand and front row and gain 10k. When I say front row, it's only the rear guards. You can't restand the Vanguard. But the thing is, you might also want the draw 2. So sometimes it's like a case where, okay, because you've got Vanguard going to Soul and you've got Fenrir being ridden over, you'd most likely have the condition to do the Soul Blast 9 by that stage of the game. So if you can do the Soul Blast sum of grade 9, then you've got your draw 2 as well. So you build up some defense, and you do miss out on Fenrir's hand trap combo because now you're no longer on Fenrir. So you can also do Soul Blast 3 and gain 10k shield onto a Guardian that you place. So that's a little bit of utility as well. I actually played against Ezel as well during that locals. So Ezel did negate my Yasurasu, which is quite funny. But yeah, that's more or less it for that card. So next we have 4 copies of Varachum. So Varachum is a hand trap card. What you can do is that you can Can Blast 1, Soul Blast 3, and then you call a unit from top of your opponent's deck onto your opponent's stand unit. So a card that hasn't usually attacked yet. Obviously there are cards in the game that can stand while attacking. But then what you can do is you can basically ruin a card in the process with this, because if they've got a card that has triggers on it or has gained power through some act skills maybe, that's already set up some attacks beforehand, set up some power gains beforehand. It's very disrupted there, but then to add more disruption, you've got Vanguard and Fenrir, so you can Spirit Call Vanguard off of this during your opponent's turn, and then you can kill another unit, and then you can use this ideally as Guardian against some other units as well. So you may, at best, be able to actually mess up 3 attacks just by guarding simply with this, but it does cost 2 Counterblast, which you have to be careful with because this deck is Counterblast heavy. And on topic of Counterblast heavy, Gleipnir, 4 copies. Now this card, you can fall into a trap where you decide to use Counterblast to actually add cards to your hand. You usually want to try and avoid using Counterblast cost because there are risks with it. Obviously, early game Counterblasting is a bit controversial because if you heal, then obviously that's fine because you've already used up 1 CB. But sometimes, obviously, when you decide not to use CB early in the game and you find a heal, it feels really awkward because it's like, oh damn, I could have used that Counterblast. But otherwise, in the later game especially, I'd definitely reconsider because you do need to control your Counterblast very carefully. This deck does play things to try and sort of find ways to countercharge, but they're not actually countercharge cards because Genesis in V format doesn't have any decent countercharge cards whatsoever. The only ones we've got that I can think of, so there's a Regalia specific card. Obviously you can't play it if you don't have a Regalia Vanguard for the countercharge. But there's also Imari, I think, yeah, Battlemate Imari, which requires 3 force markers on your Vanguard, and you don't have any ways of turboing in this list force markers, nor is it worth it really, because you'd have to then play various cards dedicated to it, and then it just becomes a bit clumpy. So you generally stay away from that. 3 force markers is generally more of a turn 5 thing, so that's not an ideal card to play. And then the other card would be some sorceress card called Estra, which is basically grade 3. There's no marker on it. It's basically Soul Blast 15, Countercharge 5. You're not going to get 15 Soul in this tech, no way. So forget about Estra, which leaves us with nothing basically in V format. So we have to find a gimmicky way of doing that. But then another thing is that Gleipnir gains 10k when attacking, so that's decent. It's Soul Blast 1, so just like earlier mentioned, Fenrir can obviously Soul Blast and gain 10k as well. You can use with any of these cards to do the Fenrir Spirit Call and get the extra attack. You can either do it on the Fenrir, or if you want to plan based on something else or whatnot, then you might decide, okay, well, at least I've got Gleipnir as a sort of outlet as well to get the Spirit Call. So you might find times where you just get into niche situations where you prefer to make a decision at a different time on what to Spirit Call. So that's also handy. And the other thing as well is that this can stack power. So if you use Yasurasu to restand it, then you're gaining 10k for the rest of the turn. So you can use the skill again because it's not once per turn. And so you can end up with 30k, not counting Yasurasu power up, not counting the force marker, or obviously any boosts and triggers as well. And on the topic of stacking power, Prometheus can also do the same. He can gain 5 as well. So not 10, but just 5. There's no cost to it. And also he can stack top 2, so you can put 1 in soul, 1 to top of the deck, and that could potentially help you trigger or just find cards you want to draw into. He's a bit of a middle ground card. He's not meant to be like really good, nor is he meant to be bad. That's kind of why I picked him. Like take for example Phosphorus. Phosphorus is great on turn 2 because he can literally soul charge more cards, and he can also just find grade 3s, and he's a hard +1 if you find the grade 3. So Phosphorus is like one of the, maybe the best right target in Genesis, but he's not very played because he's only useful for that turn 2 usually. He does have a Rhaegar skill as well, which can gain 5k, but obviously that's not really much of a seller. I did contemplate that, but obviously if I don't have space to play as many copies, I just didn't feel like playing 2, so I went for 2 Prometheus instead. You can play other choices as well. There are other good ones, like Ulysses is an example. Ulysses is okay, actually. I mean, the thing is with that card is a lot of people play for the early rush as well, but obviously you don't always draw early rush cards in turn 2, so it just starts to feel a bit dead. But in Fenrir, I think you can kind of get away with it better because Fenrir doesn't really care about when you soul charge. So like Himiko, for example, I've seen people playing Himiko. I'm not as big into Ulysses and Himiko because of the delayed soul charging. So what I mean by that is that Himiko is an act main phase skill. Same goes for Fortuna actually. And the problem with act main phase skill is that you have to have done things on turn 2. It's a bit like Appwitch Cider as well, but at least Appwitch Cider is just well, I think that card is just kind of crazy in general, so I don't really mind playing it. But the thing is with Ulysses is that you absolutely have to have it on turn 2. Otherwise you're not going to make use of that soul for Himiko's ability. In Fenrir you don't really care, so Ulysses would work quite well in this as well, I'd say, but obviously it would clash a bit with Yatagarasu to some extent. Not entirely. I mean, you can restand it and then you can just do the end of battle thing afterwards, but you won't be able to gain the power. So there's all kinds of small arguments, but they are all viable options as well. You can even play Kalmar, to be fair, if you want to have a free 20k swing, basically. That's another option as well. Obviously, you have to be careful because Vanguard is Soul Blast 1, but then Fenrir, well, you need to find ways of actually Soul Blasting 3 to use Kalmar because that requires 3 Soul Blasts to be done. So just be a bit aware of that as well. And then, yeah, that's 2 Prometheus. Next, we've got 4 copies of Skull. So Skull is the grade 3 searcher. He's quite good, not just for searching for Vanaganders and Yatagarasu as well as Fenrir, the main right target of the deck, but he's also just setting up your Rhaegar. So if you're getting Vanagander, you already know you've got Vanagander, but then this helps you also with decision making, which is that now that you know you got Vanagander, you can then prioritize getting Varachum added into your hand. Alternative, another way you can do it is that rather than Skull first and then Fenrir to shuffle after, you can also do Fenrir first and then Skull after. The reason why you may want to do that is because of Orange Witch Valencia, which basically, when Soul Blasted, puts a unit from your drop zone on the bottom of your deck, and then puts one from your drop on into Soul. So that can be helpful, but obviously you place on the bottom of your deck. So let's just say you place a heal, then Orange Witch Valencia, by putting that here on the bottom, you're not actually going to have any chance of charging because you know it's guaranteed at the bottom of the deck, which is why using Fenrir to Soul Blast Valencia as a cost, or even Vanagander if you have Vanagander available to call. Obviously, if you do that, then you can get the oranges out the way, get your trigger back, and then you can shuffle your deck after. And Skull gives you a second chance to do that after using Fenrir, because Fenrir's searching ability applies first before Orange Witch places the card, so you won't be able to shuffle until, well, by the time you shuffle, then you finally, after that, put the trigger back. So it's supposed to help with that as well, the shuffling mechanic, and the fact that it can also help you in reverse decide what to search with Fenrir, because you may have already covered one ground and you can focus on something else instead. So that's really helpful. He's also gaining 5k, so 13k boost is sometimes useful as well. And I think that's more or less it with this card. Next we've got 4 copies of Appwitch Cider. So Appwitch Cider, she basically soul charges 2 when boosting, or you can just Soul Charge 1 and bounce her to hand instead. Usually early game you just Soul Charge 2 if you draw early game, of course, with another grade 1 to ride. But then, oh, and by the way, if you do ride this, Glype, you can add it back to your hand from Soul. But what you can do is then you can build up massive Soul, but then once you're kind of done with that, then you can bounce her to hand, and that way you have like some shield for safety. Obviously, if you don't think you're going to be hurt, or if you think for whatever reason that maybe you want to, maybe you're not going to need that circle that it's boosting to be vacant, because sometimes you might decide you want to free up that slot for something else to be called later. Can occasionally happen. Just be a bit careful, I guess. Just kind of be aware. At least in general when playing this card in any deck, really. But you may decide just be a bit greedy and just keep on the field for longer, or you might, yeah, you just bounce it whenever you feel like you're in danger, basically. So this is kind of handy all around. And then for which of orange is Valencia. So this card, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Soul Blast it, put a card back to the bottom of your deck, but also put a card from drop into your Soul. So by Soul Blasting this, you maintain the same amount of cards as Soul, because you're refunding, which is what makes this card nice. And because Fenrir is main phase Soul Blast to search the deck, that's also good as well. So that can be very helpful as well. And you can also do Soul Blast 2, so you can do Soul Blast 2 grade 1s, search for, say, Varachum or Glypner or something, and they can just trigger off oranges alongside. So you may decide to do that rather than Soul Blasting a grade 2, even if you had the grade 2 in Soul. That's also a thing. Also, this card is a bit like Ulixis, obviously a 2-card combo, but you can basically neg 2 to draw 1. That may be a thing you might do because you decided to rush your opponent, but you don't want to them to attack your rear guards for whatever reason. I don't think that's as big of a deal in this format, but or sorry, not format, in this deck list even. But that's also a thing, an option. Obviously, this card was designed with Camo in mind, even though, funny enough, Orange is supposed to pair with Grape Witch, and Camo is supposed to pair with Frog Witch. They kind of decided to make in the V-Series Orange go with Camo, which is a bit funny, but I don't know if we're getting V-Series Grapes later down the line. But yeah, Spirit Calling Camo is basically free if you do want to play that, and you can basically just use oranges to make it feel like an actual 1-for-1 rather than an egg. She's also building Soul, which is quite good, and she's also able to go into the Soul herself, which is also nice. But really, the idea is you put heals back into your deck, and then you shuffle with Fenrir or Skull. Obviously, Skull's more likely, because if you're doing it with Fenrir, you would have to shuffle before you put the card back if you Soul Blast via Fenrir's cost. Or if you have Vanguard and you play from hand, then even better, because then Fenrir can do shuffling instead and give you a chance, an actual real chance of being able to dodge it heal. And Vanguard checks top 3, and you're doing that multiple times, so you can try and kind of find that heal eventually. And that's your Countercharge engine, basically. That's the best you can really make do with. You can't let this game drag on too long, because you will run out of resource. You have to be able to push eventually, which is why we have the finishes in the deck as well, and we want to re-ride just to get a bit more pressure and just still feel like we're progressing the game, because you don't want to delay it anymore. And obviously an opponent that starts healing down, it's going to get a bit annoying as well. So try and lead damage if you can. Then we've got 4 copies of Kushinada. So Kushinada is the draw perfect card, just good to have in general. Then we've got 8 criticals as well, and then we've got 4 grade 3 heals. The appeal here really is the fact that it's a grade 3, and grade 3s are good for Yasurasu as well. Or if you play E1 like a Hime, also quite good for that as well. As in, like, you can target this Soul Charge and then get the grade 3 and set up Yasurasu, but that's a whole different deck. I could make a deck profile on that. I have tried it before. But obviously you don't get as much power because it's a 50k shield. That's really the downside of the card. And obviously the reason people play it is because they're just worried they'll get like cheesed out in the early game. That's literally the only reason for this card being played. You compromise in defense later just so that you don't get high rolled out of the game. And that's pretty much it for my deck profile. If you want to see more deck profiles like these, then subscribe, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.